It's hard to see where a bear could ever belong in such a strange, cold city.
Paddington is a phenomenal film, and if like me you made the mistake of assuming this to be some straightforward kids movie attempting to cash in on old property, then like me you've been very wrong. There's a lot of different things I want to say about this film, but from a personal position, can I begin by relating this to the video I made a while back criticising the fairly recent Tom and Jerry film for the many things I felt were wrong with that movie. That film was, though, like Paddington, a mix of live action and animation based on a beloved children's franchise brought to the big screen. Now, many of the comments on that video argued I was unfair to criticise Tom and Jerry because I'm not the target audience. It's a kids' film. And whilst that's true, Paddington showcases just how much more a kids' film can be. You know, why should just some random baseless film to distract little kids for 90 minutes be enough? Why can't we offer them genuine emotion and something to stimulate, and even if solely on an unconscious level, give them some thought? And, you know, why not go beyond simple distraction and entertainment and actually provide something genuinely fun? Something that will stick in the child's mind long after the film ends. There's an often overlooked art to making films fun. The Tom and Jerry movie, like so many other examples, settle for generic pop culture references or easy, sometimes cringy jokes that will entertain a child but do no more than that. Paddington, however, is a genuine joy to watch. Not just for kids, but for everyone. There's so much I want to say about this film, but with what I've said there in mind, I'm going to split this into two distinct sections. First, we'll talk about the heart, the more thematic and emotional stuff, and then we'll talk about the fun, what makes this film such a joy, the technical aspects of how it works, the more general review stuff of why I loved it. So let's just get into that. To summarise the general premise of Paddington, say a British explorer once ventured to darkest Peru and discovered an intelligent species of bear.
Done. Good Lord. Now try Stratford upon Avon.
And inasmuch as they could communicate, he instilled in them a love for London, giving them an almost tourist's glimpse of a rosy world of beautiful buildings, polite people who talk about the weather, and
marmalade.
Then, say years later, long after that explorer's died and those bears have grown old with a son of their own, their home is hit with a natural disaster that forces their son to have to move, so they think of London and all they were told of it by this caricature of a British man. They think of how, during World War II, children in need would be left at train stations with tags around their necks and kind families would take them in to look after. London occurs the most sensible place to send that young bear, so he stows away in a boat with nothing but a suitcase full of marmalade and hopes to find a home in Britain. And that is basically the premise not just of the film Paddington, but of the original children's stories from the 50s too, which, if you think about it, is quite bold. Paddington is an illegal immigrant in ways that would probably get him detained in often worryingly horrible conditions were he real.
What? Like an orphanage?
But quite bold to think that a children's story from the late 50s at a time of widespread racial inequality that provides an unforced, very simple heartfelt message of equality. A story about this strange bear finding a home and learning to belong in an entirely different world, and of this family daring to trust and let a stranger into their hearts enough that he can become one of their family. And if you wanted to, you could say, well, that's all fine and rosy as a children's story message, but it's not that simple in reality. In reality, if you waited at a train station with a label around your neck nowadays, you'd get flat out ignored, and any attempts you might make to ask for help would probably be treated like an invented sob story.
Keep your eyes down, there's some sort of bear over there, probably selling something. Good evening. No, thank you.
Which is something I loved about this film. Whilst it is very much a heartwarming children's story, it doesn't shy away from many of the complexities and conflicts around immigration. A cynical neighbour who's mistrustful and doesn't like this strange bear moving into the well-respected neighbourhood.
Leave him in a bear, the most unpleasant creature.
A daughter who doesn't mean anything against Paddington personally, but is embarrassed at the thought of anyone from school knowing they've taken him in.
Don't tell anyone at school about Paddington. Why not? because everyone thinks we're weird enough without the bear.
Distancing herself from him out of fear she'll be picked on about it. A father who feels both that you're not supposed to just take someone in and that there's a more proper and legal way to do things, but also who feels wary of this strange being and is worried for the safety of his family around Paddington. Maybe not exactly, but in some ways you can take these difficulties and apply them not just to a strange bear, but to any immigrant coming into any new country. Even just the smaller issues like a cabbie who takes you on a deliberately longer and more expensive route precisely because you're not from here and won't notice and therefore can be exploited. The film doesn't shy away from any of that, and we get a real sense of Paddington's struggle to belong in this distant land. There is a disconnect between the caricature of a British man and his rosy world and what London actually proves to be. We see Paddington deeply missing Peru at points, deeply misunderstanding London, struggling with homelessness even, and more simply not being trusted because he's a bear. And yes, obviously there is a central message of kindness here. However, the Brown family who take Paddington in are very kind, yet still do have difficulties around living with Paddington, which is an important point to include because it isn't always just about kindness. It's also about trust. Daring to trust that a stranger won't harm you or steal from you or exploit your kindness. Because I think we can all basically be kind. The biggest struggle is whether to dare risk showing it or not. And anyone who's seen more than a tourist's glimpse of London knows it's not always a rosy world of good manners.
There are thieves, murderers and pickpockets on every platform.
And there are realistically many people out there in the world who we shouldn't trust extensively, but does our fear for those dangers break our trust in those who deserve it?
How can he live with us if we can't even trust him?
The film doesn't even shy away from some of the old colonial issues around this explorer venturing to darkest Peru, because that is a problematic point. But we get a scene late into this film that shows that explorer, Montgomery Clyde, being criticised by his contemporaries for not bringing back either dead or caged bears from his discovery. Montgomery Clyde argues they can't do that because
these were no dumb beasts. I mean, they were intelligent and civilised.
And the rest of them respond,
They didn't even speak English.
Well, no, but...
Do they play cricket?
Drink tea? Do the crossword?
Pretty rum idea of civilization you've got, Clyde.
an intelligent species of bear nonetheless being treated as subhuman and inferior because they are different to British society. The film points out Montgomery Clyde was the unlikely exception for the time, and because he won't tell the others the location of these bears in order that they can capture one, they all shun him from the Explorers Guild. Which is quite a dark, honest point about Britain's past, weaved seamlessly into a very light film by presenting it in a very tongue-in-cheek manner. So not only is it very skilled to be able to include that in a way that doesn't break the tone of this film, but it's an important point to include because, again, it makes the slightly magical realism world of this film where people seem to accept that a bear can talk, and makes it a little more real in the ways that matter, because if this was about kindness and trust set in a world where horrible things never happen, that typical children's book rosy existence, not to criticise that, but then the message would seem simple and fall flat beyond just a children's viewing. Because the world is more real than that though, because it doesn't avoid many of the complexities, the message becomes twice as strong and twice as important. Finding kindness in a world that can often be quite dark. But what's the arc of this film exactly? I mean, I suppose the main struggle appears to be Paddington learning to belong in a culture that feels strange and sometimes dark, leading us to a conclusion where he can finally say,
Because although I don't look like anyone else, I really do feel at home. I will never be like other people, but that's all right, because I'm a bear. A bear called Paddington.
But really, development-wise, Paddington changes very little in this film. He's well-mannered and kind throughout, albeit slightly naive to London's more exploitative sides. Really, his struggle is less about developing than simply maintaining his good-heartedness, not letting the sometimes dark experience of life, and those occasions where he is exploited, break that heart. And so in his place, all the character development centres around the Brown family instead, not just to learn to let Paddington in and to learn to trust this stranger, but for the family members to learn to get on better with each other. Our introduction to them in this film is seeing them squabble. They've been on a day trip to the War Museum with the idea of doing things together will help them get along more, but it seems to have made no real difference at all. They're like most families really, they care about each other, just don't always get along. Arguably they haven't really all found their space in the family, and though in much smaller ways, are searching for that space just as much as Paddington is. For example, we've got a brilliantly creative son with a streak for dangerous experiments set against a risk analyst father who won't let him do or play with anything even remotely dangerous.
Jonathan, don't jump like that. 7% of childhood accidents start with jumping.
Which is of course also a main theme here, safety. How much do we protect the safety of ourselves and our families, and how much does safety become something stifling? How much does it hold us back?
What's the point of them being happy if they're not safe?
And we've got a daughter called Judy who, in Paddington's words,
suffers from a serious condition called embarrassment.
Who daren't bring her boyfriend Tony home for fear her family will embarrass her, particularly her mum. And then also Mrs. Bird, who is admittedly less in conflict, but still to some extent seen as an old bat to ignore, where we later find she is actually quite wise. Also, she outdrinks security guards. And so it's through their experience of this bear attempting to connect with them, and through experiencing how he dares to trust others, that they learn how better to connect with each other in a very natural and unforced way. Paddington's unwavering goodness enables him to positively affect pretty much everyone he encounters. But it also serves to unify the Brown family. So much so that the third act becomes them working as a perfect team to save Paddington, utilising each other's skills and showing their character growth to an extent Mr. Brown even proves able to take risks. The thing is, the Brown family needed Paddington. They just didn't realise it until they actually opened up enough to let him in, as is so often the case I think. Sometimes it's only in opening your heart to begin with that you realise there was a hole that needed filling at all. Trust is scary, sometimes dangerous and exploited. Paddington's trust in the kindness of others leads him into the danger of Millicent. However, if you never trust and never choose to trust, because sometimes I think it is a choice, then you're left like the most distrustful character in this film is, alone. Mr. Curry is perhaps the loneliest of all the characters, which I think is what makes his character work, to be honest. He's not just some one-dimensional grumpy cynic. He's actually lonely to the extent that it's very, very easy to manipulate him emotionally with the offer of comfort and romance. Ironically, his distrustful nature leaves him easily manipulated and trusting perhaps the only person in this film you're not supposed to trust, Millicent. This film is an absolute delight to watch from start to finish, and contrary to the thinking of most film companies, that is not from playing on nostalgia, making dumb pop culture references, and I guess doing whatever the hell Space Jam 2 did.
What up? It's Porky Pig. They call me P-double-L-G. Step to me, he don't want no trouble.
Marmalade?
Firstly, it's a delight because of the very obvious thing. Strong characters. What children's stories in general tend to do is exaggerate character traits in a slightly cartoony way, but always still have something truthful at their core to ground them. For example, Mr. Brown naturally has some anxiety for his family's safety, the way any parent often would, but here that anxiety is central emotionally to the theme of trust and safety in this film. Because it fits so neatly in that sense, it affords freedom to exaggerate it much more without it seeming incoherent or over the top or a bit of a distraction from the story. Because it fits and because the emotion at its core is very relatable, they can say, let's make him a risk analyst who is overly anxious about everything and exaggerate as much as possible.
Becoming a father does strange things to a man.
Could you be careful? There's a baby here. Could you step back? There's a baby coming through.
Mr. Curry similarly. We understand him to be a cynical and lonely man, so the side of him that falls blindly for the only woman to pay him any attention is understandable. And again, his cynicism plays an important role thematically, therefore exaggerating it isn't a distraction, and because the grumpy old man trope is grounded here with a sense of loneliness, it doesn't become incoherent when they play it up for things like this.
Found these tied to a lamppost and I thought, waste not, want not.
Charming.
Which is a gag I just love, by the way. If you just make characters do wacky things without any emotional core to their behaviour, it just feels a bit baffling in ways that would work for meme humour but not for 90-minute cinematic journeys you're supposed to be invested in. I think that point makes sense. There's also the importance of lots of different types of comedy, so even if I take one isolated scene in this film, you've got comedy in dialogue.
Oh look, Henry, it's perfect.
You want to call him Ketchup?
No.
Ketchup the bear?
Paddington.
Noise gags.
My name is...
Off-screen gags.
Paddington. Paddington! Oh, sorry.
Background gags. And this is just a very short scene.
That's not right.
And elsewhere we'll also find more visual gags.
No, not an orphanage. It would be more like an institution for young souls whose parents have, sadly, passed on.
Musical gags.
Hello.
Physical gags.
Geographers, turn your backs.
And transitional gags. I don't think I've termed any of those correctly, but probably a load of others as well, including ones it's a little too long-winded to explain, such as the cliche shot of Paddington looking at the sights of London and being in awe of his new surroundings, turning out to be because the cabbie took a deliberately longer route to charge them more.
Young Bear said it was his first time in London. I thought I'd show him the sights. Should have charged more.
But I think having lots of different styles of comedy helps to create lots of different layers around the main story. I think if it's just one or two styles, they stick out a little more and it looks like you've taken a story and then tried to cram comedy bits into it, whereas all the different layers help blend it in a bit better. And there is, of course, the other main type of comedy we see here being slapstick humour, which actually I do find the weakest of the humour in this film. Perhaps that's because I'm not a child, I don't know. I don't think it's always executed perfectly though. Still well, never badly at all, but just not quite at the level of everything else. But that does still make for a nice comparison to my Tom and Jerry video on the movie where none of the slapstick worked, because here the film gives each hit proper time to have impact. Lingers on the expression so you can feel the force of the slapstick.
Embarrassing. But tasty.
And you also choose music that complements the hits. But most importantly, they always have a sense of narrative. It's not just watching a bear randomly falling over or causing destruction for no reason, because again that would pull you out of the film. In the bathroom scene, the narrative is two things. One is Paddington struggling to understand human culture and customs. He's supposed to be using the toilet to freshen up, but he doesn't quite know what that means or what the facilities are, and so accidentally causes havoc out of this. Which then means it's slapstick humour that informs the theme of learning to belong in a place that feels strange and adapting to different customs. But it's also a narrative of Mr. Brown on the phone trying to boost his insurance because of having a bear in the house, expecting disaster. So you then get Mr. Brown anxious about disaster on the phone, set against Paddington gradually causing it, and that creates a nice dynamic and back and forth to the scene.
Thank you for holding. Your call is
moderately
important to us.
Or later, there's a similar narrative for Paddington misunderstanding customs by trying to return a wallet to a pickpocket, but there's now the narrative of a chase scene where the pickpocket thinks Paddington is a police officer.
Some kind of tiny police bear.
You know, I made this point in my Tom and Jerry movie video already, but it's just worth emphasising again here. Slapstick that's just getting hit without any real reason or purpose becomes a lot more boring than slapstick with a sense of narrative, even if it's a very subtle one. And the third and final thing I want to say on the point of fun is storytelling techniques, and I think this one is particularly important for a kids movie, or a family movie technically. I just say kids because that's the main demographic. I think all good kids movies appeal to older ages too, but the classic thing people say is that it takes a lot more to keep kids engaged nowadays, and I think that is true. The thing is, however, keeping them engaged doesn't always mean a load of flashiness for the sake of it. You can chuck a load of bright colours or loud music or a pop culture reference, or build everything up on epic proportions like the Tom and Jerry movie tried to do, or Space Jam 2 actually, but if there's no substance behind any of it, it's just a load of white noise, really. Kids aren't that stupid most of the time. And I suppose one of the small things that just struck me watching this film is that Paddington uses lots of different visual storytelling methods that are A, yeah, they are flashy and look cool, but B, work because they break the film up with these different methods and give it a structure and all a degree of rhythm that help keeps you engaged. For example, the film opens using an old black and white film to tell the story with old-time TV sounding music, then set against the bright coloured and real-time shots of Peru that create a nice contrast. We get a montage of piling jars in a boat to show passing of time. The location of London is set via a delivery van carrying mail. We get this Wes Anderson dollhouse effect to talk us through the members of the family, or a rotating camera in the circular home to enhance this whirlwind feel of a family where everybody is struggling to get along. We get the train animation when Mr. Groover tells his story, we melt through the projector screen when Paddington misses home, and there's this cool effect when he's searching for Montgomery Clyde. You get the point. Just taking a bit of time to think a little more creatively about how to tell a scene can then make it so much more engaging. Breaking up the plot with different visual styles of storytelling that all have substance here behind them because each method informs the emotion of that specific scene. Paddington, above all, is heartfelt and really, really fun. I cannot recommend this film enough, and I am so excited to watch the sequel that I'm told is even better. There's a ton more I wanted to say, like the fact some of the staging in this film is beautiful, or that the personality given to more background characters is wonderful, such as the scene of two security guards testing each other on the contents of a packet of Oreos.
Carbohydrates per biscuit is 7.7 grams.
But I just thought I'd end quickly with a single extra thing that I loved about this film, and I might make this a regular way to end my videos, I don't know. What I loved is the use of Calypso music in the soundtrack with a Calypso band to celebrate the Windrush culture of London. It's just a very small touch, but an important one to help express the multicultural beauty of Britain, or more specifically London. Not just because Calypso music is apparently the sort of music that would have been played a lot at the time and area where Michael Bond wrote the original books, but also because it underpins the whole point of this film. A stranger overseas who was curious about British culture, just the way Montgomery was curious about bear culture, and how that natural curiosity, sometimes mixed with forced circumstances, can help us to unite all divides and merge culture in small ways that hopefully don't cancel out our roots. Nothing brings people together quite like music, and in terms of examples for London, what better soundtrack to have than a Calypso band singing "London is the place for me." London is the place for me. That's my thoughts anyway. I'll probably do another video on Paddington 2 whenever I watch it. Like the video if you liked it, comment your thoughts, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you want, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And the special thank you goes to Devin, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Janice McMahon, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.